Thank you so much for being here. My name is Sage Morgan Hubbard, and I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Museum of African American History of Boston and Nantucket. And we're so glad that you're here on this beautiful sunny day. And happy Pride and almost Juneteenth. These are good times and often very dark times, so it's nice to see all of your faces here, and we're really excited that you're in this wonderful space. As Angela will probably mention some more, this is our 220th anniversary in this space. This building was built in 1806. If you look down, these are the original floorboards that folks like Frederick Douglass and everyone spoke in. So this is a place of power and ancestry, and we're excited tonight to have some more amazing speakers and guests and to work with Queer History Boston. So thank you so much for being here, welcome. And as our CEO loves to say, this is in the Black Baptist church tradition, we want to hear your voices, right? This is not a place to just be silent. If you want to say something, go clap and shout and make some noise. Exactly. If the Spirit moves you, if you don't agree with stuff, you can make some or like whatever kind of sounds, or look down, or like disagree, right? We want this to be a space of dialogue and conversation. And I think we have some wonderful conversation tonight about a really important topic. So I'm going to pass the mic to Matisse and enjoy.
Well, thank you so much, Sage. And thank you so much to the Museum of African American History for hosting this this dialogue tonight. I'm so excited. Yes, give a round of applause to the Museum of African American History. Yes. So I'm Matisse Dupont. I'm Director of Engagement at Queer History Boston, and I'm just so excited for this panel tonight. My Executive Director, Joan, will be rolling in any minute. There's Joan. Welcome, Joan. Joan will be moderating the panel this evening, but I'm going to introduce our panelists while Joan settles, and she's just rolling right in. So I'm going to bring up Angela Tate first. Angela Tate is the Chief Director of Collection of African American History, and we're so glad you're joining. Yeah, just pick your seat. Next up, Ariel Gray. Ariel Gray is a reporter at WUR and has written an amazing piece for WUR about the Edmonia Lewis show at PEM, and also an amazing piece about Edmonia Lewis and queerness on her Substack, so you have to make sure you read that. Next up is Giselle Bird. Giselle Bird is the Artistic Offensive, one of Boston's longest running theater, art, and culture institutions, and we just love a good museum. Giselle and I saw the PBS show together, so we're like, ooh, we love a museum. We love a museum. Hi. And last but not least is Theo Tyson. Welcome, Theo Tyson. Independent curator and just fashion icon, historian, just such an important figure in our local scene, and really happy to have you all here. And well, I'm just going to start off with our first question. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
So, my first question is, when did you meet Edmonia, and what was that like? How did you meet her? What was your first encounter? Does anyone want to go first?
I'm way too excited about this.
You're going last.
I'll go, I guess.
This is all in
The math tried to keep me away so hard. But I'm so glad to be here. So when did you first meet
So a part of my lore is that I used to run a history blog that was about the Gilded Age, Edwardian era, just turn of the century. And I wrote a lot about people, particularly women, because women's history still is considered to be a subset of history, which I disagree with. And at the time, this was maybe 15 years ago, it was still seen as a story of an artist who was celebrated and then disappeared. No one knew what happened after she left the United States for Italy, and then no one knows where she was buried. And so that was my first encounter with Edmonia, like, oh, she just existed and disappeared. And everyone left it at that.
My first encounter was when I was doing an obituary for a local artist named Fern Cunningham, a local Black sculptor who has pieces up around Boston. If you guys haven't heard of her, she's amazing. And one of her friends, Ekma Holmes, had said to me that, you know, she had some influences, and Edmonia Lewis was one of them. And this was some years ago, and I had never really heard of Edmonia like that, despite her connection to Boston. And so that's kind of when I started researching more about who she was and what she did here.
Hey y'all, y'all made it on this good warm day. I first met Edmonia because of Matisse. Matisse and I, you have become my chosen family, I hope you realize. And my then boyfriend at the time and I were just always curious, like, what can we do different on a weekend? And it was like, we can walk the puppy only so much. And so one day, Matisse was like, are you gonna go to the Edmonia Lewis exhibit at the Peabody Essex Museum? And I was like, so funny, I haven't ever been to the Peabody Essex. Or is it Peabody? Yeah. Peabody, okay, no, I'm from Georgia. So, listen, that's what Alphonics was saying, Peabody. Anyways, but I got Worcester right. We did a little road trip to Salem. I was like, I've been to the British Museum way too many times, but okay, let's go. Y'all, that museum is interesting. But anyway, so we go, and Matisse was literally like my own personal, like, curator who didn't curate it, but was filling in all the gaps and things that were missing from the curation. And Matisse looks at me and says, they completely left her queerness out of here. And then the very next day after we went to the exhibition, my chosen aunt, Ife Franklin, an extraordinary multidisciplinary artist, says, Edmonia Lewis was queer, we will not be erased. And then I just went down a little rabbit hole of just discovering who this brilliant woman was and what she left us, the gifts that she left us. And as a storyteller, that inspires me. And I feel like right now in this moment where we're seeing art and culture be really stripped of the real contributions, it was a really pleasant reminder that we have to fight to make sure folks remember that we were here and that we changed how people think, how they feel, how we see and experience art. And so that's how I met Edmonia, and she really changed something for me. So, thanks, Matisse. You look like we're doing the Wicked Christ. Means how do I know Boston, which means how do I know Matisse, how do I know you, like how do I know everyone? What I have in my lap is the blueprint that we started for the show that is at Peabody Essex Museum right now, and that was July 2018. I hadn't graduated yet, and I went back to school a little late. I'm young, lad. And so I met Edmonia Wildfire Lewis through Dr. Andrea Barnwell Brownlee, through Kirsten Pye Buick, who wrote the first book about her, just Let's be clear. And Kirsten Pine Buick was also one of I knew how to write press releases and things of that sort. I didn't know how to write about art. But then it's like you realize it's all storytelling and it's figuring out the audience. And I also have to, and we have to do this because I came here through the Athenaeum as a fellow, which was through Spelman, and so there's this lineage. And I always want to do the best I can to name people. She's gonna be angry about this. Michelle Broey is one of those people. When I showed up in Boston and I walked into a space and I'm like, hey, queer people. Because it took me a while to find black people. There were a lot of gay people, but there weren't a lot of black people. And so when we're talking about bringing Edmonia into the space, I presented to the Athenaeum the story of Edmonia Lewis that they had not heard before, even though they held a lot of her works, papers, so on and so forth. And it's really about the archive, I think, is part of what this conversation is. And so it's like, how do we know Edmonia is the same way that we all know and connect to each other, and how we make sure that this isn't, I've been, okay, it's fine, no, it's fine, sit there. We've been talking about counter narratives a lot, and I wonder if that could be damaging in some way, because the queer conversation of Edmonia is not a counter narrative. It's a truth that just hasn't been told. And so that's how I met her. And that's how I want to kind of like center this. And thank you, mentees. Don't worry about that. It's like my little jumper thing.
And yeah, that's so, I mean, everyone's answers to that were so beautiful. And I think that I want to comment about some archives, but also that, you know, the first time I encountered Edmonia Lewis was A Picture in Improper Bostonians, which is a book that our organization, called the History Project, put out in 1998. It's great, but it's also from 1998, so like grain of salt on that. But like you were saying, she was someone whose stories was told in a way like she made an impact, she was amazing, and now she's lost to history. And I always thought that wasn't very fair. To her own story, but also that she's told through these lenses of white women a lot of the time. And this is something Ariane brought up a few times when we were talking about Edmonia recently, and like, how do we know and how can we connect with her own story when the evidence that's left is not necessarily created by her. So there's not a question quite there. Like, I'd like to talk about that a bit, but also part of why Queer History Boston exists is because we knew that there were queer materials in archives. We were started in 1980, but they weren't being talked about queerly or being described queerly. And to think about 2018 and a local institution saying, oh, we haven't heard this story before, but we have all this stuff, is, excuse my language, we're being recorded, fucking wild. And so it's one of those things. Just bringing my energy to the room. A lot of emotional swearing. But that's exactly it. And then it makes me start thinking about everything else that's still buried in archives, if they exist there at all. And so I think my question here, or if anyone wants to save me and help me land the plane, is basically, what have you done about this? Where has this shown up in other places in your lives? Where are we still looking at public exhibits in 2026 and seeing what's missing? And why is that? That's like 10 questions, I apologize.
I can start. I think the way that it shows up in my life as a journalist is that there is this tension in journalism between what is fact and what is truth, because the two are not always equal. And in her book on Edmonia, Moving Stones, Jennifer Brody quotes Simone Leib, and I'm kind of like paraphrasing it here, but basically that sometimes with the archive, we have to shift and move things around to reveal something that is more real than fact, right? And so in journalism, a lot of times what's demanded of us is fact, is proof, is evidence. And I'm often at the edge of instinct and of what I know is true, and then having to somehow prove that what I know is true. And it shows up a lot in my work. Like when I covered Edmonia for WBUR, I wasn't really able to explore her queerness as an aspect of her life because there's not enough concrete historical evidence to back it up. And so I often run into that problem where there's a special sort of violence, I think, in requiring people who've lived under fugitivity to somehow have proof and evidence, because so much of our safety is based in not being seen and not being perceived sometimes. And so I think that, I think that's, as a journalist, that's sometimes really hard, because I know things to be true that, y'all may not have proof for, but in my community, like, I know it to be true. And that's how I've approached Edmonia.
I would like for everyone to clap.
So much unseen in terms of safety. That hits different for me, especially as a Black trans woman in this world where there are these really strange narratives that your passability will keep you safe and it will protect you from everything in this world. And you talked about counter narratives being dangerous, and I feel like that is a really dangerous one, because why can't I just be and walk in and just be and present however I want to? Sure, I look like a damn poppy, but I wanted to present as such. And that may appeal to certain people. But what I'm learning as an executive and an artistic director, having to hold both of those hats, and also presenting art by, for, and about queer and trans people of color, is that that our humanity isn't up for debate. Nothing can be compromised. And when I think, I'm deep in these 3 a.m. brain dumps with, my puppy's knocked out, and I'm like, okay, I'm awake. I had to get something to drink, so now I'm awake, and my mind is racing about what stories have we not been able to tell because white mediocrity has said we're not allowed to. And I no longer call it supremacy, it's mediocre. There's nothing supreme about that. And so I started thinking about transcendent tales. And I said, how do we take these stories that we've always known and then apply them to our people who've experienced these same narratives, but have often been, they have to like climb over a wall. What does it mean when you see trans women of color tell the story of Steel Magnolias, which everyone knows to be told through Southern white women? But when you put that into a Black hair salon with one of these characters now being more of a butch femme, and then, but they're all still telling the same story. There's nothing being changed. It's the same narrative, but it impacts you differently, and you get to see different people in your community that way. I think in this moment, we are being forced to think that the one humanity that matters is white. and that is the only one that feels and breathes and experiences anything, when it's the complete opposite. All whiteness has known is domination, and it's not successful, because who often dominates and succeeds are queer and trans people of color. I mean, just looking at Edmonia sculptures, I was like, but I went to a whole arts college and not one professor spoke her name. Why was this? And it's because there's this want for assimilation that we cannot be this brilliant. But it's because we've always been more brilliant. And so for me, I like producing work by people who are the living playwrights of our time, who know how to tell stories that were bold, that are about real life people, and everyday people too. You know, we're starting rehearsals on a play called Smoke, written by Lady Dame Figueroa Aditi, and it opens at the end of this month. And it's set during the Washington race riots. And it's about this Black trans woman inhabiting her grandmother's home and coming back home to Baltimore. And people will go like, oh, this is so strong of a narrative. But there were trans people around during this time, y'all. There were queer people around during this time. There were Black people around. And so for me, it's almost like we just landed one day and they're like, wow, you're different. But I just fight to produce those stories through a lens that people try to forget and serve as a reminder. And I think this exhibition served as a reminder. I think this panel and these conversations serve as reminders. And I just fight really hard at every level to make sure that we don't ever think we don't deserve access or deserve to be platformed and spoken of and remembered and have that memory cemented.
Yeah, that was beautiful.
Thank you. So, you know, I am the chief curator here, and I come to this conversation from the lens of experiencing the violence of building a career in museums, of building a career in academia, where I entered the field expansively, doing everything that interested me, and as I built my career brick by brick, as I was telling someone earlier, and moved up the career ladder, I was being forced into a narrower and narrower gaze, where people questioned me, like, why would you be interested in Asian American history? And I was like, well, I did work on a Chinatown project where I am going through the archive and seeing these Chinese Americans encountering and engaging with the Black and Latino communities in the 19th century. It wasn't just the history of Chinese exclusion. It was a history of community building in Southern California. But that is not what people are taught when they're thinking about different histories. They're siloed. You are supposed to stick with your own background and your own culture. If you deviate from that, they look at you like, why are you here? And then as I moved into I call it the apex of my career, even though I don't like the way people see that. And I have experienced people kind of dismissing me until I mentioned I worked at the Smithsonian. And I was like, it's a museum of museums, but it's not the only place to work. It's not the only legitimizing role to have in this field. And I was at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, but I was also detailed to what is now known as the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. And if you've read news reports about that, they are saying, no, we're not gonna fund it and we don't actually want it to exist. And that's not even from the administration. That came from inside the Smithsonian well before he was even elected. And that's why a lot of the conversations that I've started to have here is about what does it mean for women's history, for queer history, to other entities, other identities, other communities to be seen as a subset of the main history. And so when I was approached about being on the panel for this conversation, I started thinking about the extraordinary violence of, as you said, like they have this archive and they've never read it through that lens because frankly, you're not trained to read it through multiple lenses. If you say you are an art historian of mid-19th century American art, that's all you are trained to read the archive through. Any other deviation, as they want to call it, is considered to be a distraction. It's considered to be something that is not a part of the canon. If you want to go down that rabbit hole, sometimes they'll tell you you need to find another advisor because we don't do that. And so when thinking about Edmonia Lewis's queerness and how we find that, I'm also interested in, when I was going through the exhibition on Monday, that she existed in her full self in Black churches, in Black organizations, in Black abolitionist circles. And so my first encounter of her being someone who disappeared in the archive, no one knows where she was buried, well, the Black community at the time still knew who she was. They were still keeping track of her. And so what does that tell you about what is happening when people archive papers? What is happening when people look to particular repositories as the arbiters of truth? What are the silences that are actually created by the people who are working in these fields? And so a lot of the work that I do is how do we counteract that? Even though I'm like, the one and only, a lot of times being called on in these historical societies here, also a lot of, everybody knows about Paul Revere, and I'm like, can we move beyond Paul? But also learning that the Abel Barbados, who was the master brick mason that built the bricks for this museum, lived next door to him. How many people who would take the Freedom Trail will ever learn of that? How many people who take the Freedom Trail will ever connect that history to the history that was happening here? And that's a deliberate silence that is created and perpetuated by how the field develops, how we are trained to look at history, and also how people consider everything else that isn't a major narrative to be a distraction. And so this conversation that we're having right here is, we're not finding something that's hidden. We're actually making that the central lens that we are looking at Edmonia Lewis.
That's my friend. No, but thank you for having us here at the African Meeting House to have this conversation and talking about Edmonia. And when we really think about what it means to put a queer lens on something, the base level of that, outside of humanity, is taking it outside of, my friend's gonna know what I'm about to say. It's taking it outside of that white, heteronormative, patriarchal gaze. That's all it is. And Edmonia was like, I don't wanna fucking do this. I'm leaving. She did the Overland thing, and they tried to we all know the Overland story, yes?
Tell it.
White women tears. That's the short version. She was accused of poisoning her roommates and stealing art supplies and so on and so forth, and none of that actually happened. But she was one of the first Black women to be on that campus and to excel in the way that she did. And one of the things about my lived experience, one of the things about being in a queer space is you're just doing things in a way that nobody wants you to, and there's not a blueprint for it. And so you're just outside of whatever the white heteronormative, you're just outside of what that looks like. And so even as you're thinking about a job that you want, a partner that you want to engage yourself with, what that looks like changes if someone views you in a queer lens. And so you think about Edmonia, again, was like, no, I'm leaving. And she just went around. I'm gonna hang out with these folks. And again, that's where a good majority of those beautiful works that she created came from. because she stepped outside of an expectation. And I'm of an age where things are changing, and I'm trying to keep up. But one of the reasons that I use the term queer, and I think about Edmonia as queer, is I'm just not going to do what I'm told based on my genitalia. That's it.
And that's something, I have 3 different points. I'm trying to remember them out loud because the ADHD meds wear off about this time of day. And, but one of them is, Giselle, as you were talking about your experience and we came out of nowhere, and it's, no, we always have been. We always have existed. We're not, what is it, we're not Athena. We didn't pop out of Zeus's head fully formed. We have always been part of the community and throughout all time. And it's exhausting having to argue that over and over again. And so I just wanted to say I hear you. You're welcome. And then, Angela, I was thinking about, as you were talking about doing this kind of work that gets sort of labeled as not mainstream. A friend of mine, when I was talking about this panel and some of the work that we're doing, said, you better watch out, you're gonna end up on a committee. And we could get into that here about how that's where a lot of these, I think, transgressions sometimes go to die. It's a committee. Anyone who is not the mainstream ends up on the committee, and you're in the committee, and the committee does nothing, and you're expected to do all this extra work for the committee, and then it's 10 years later, and you're like,
so good in pictures.
yeah. Oh, you look so good. You look so good on fundraising forms, fundraising grant reports when you're on the committee. And so that's something that there's a lot of power in being like, oh no, we're not gonna litigate this, we're gonna do it. And I think that's something, this is so corny, but I think about write yourself a postcard for a couple of weeks from now being like, fuck this, we're doing it. And this is how I get into trouble, and my staff knows this. I'm like, we're doing it live, let's roll. So I wanted to mention that, and then oh shit, what's the third thing? Around queerness and history. That was what it was in reading Edmonia as queer. A lot of the times, at least in my work, I tend to look at who's transgressing gender and sexuality norms of their times, and in what ways. And I think that very broadly, that can include a ton of people. It doesn't matter what label they may have used in their own time period, but we can see that kinship and that relationship, and they can be queer and they can be trans. And just in Edmonia's photos of herself, looking beautiful and put together and masculine and wearing the sculptor hat that they or she was. There's so many missed opportunities to talk about the possibilities there when you have literally the person right in front of you. So that was the riff I wanted to make. That was the third point. So I'm really here to ask questions to keep us moving forward, not to be the Joan show. So.
Very good, man.
I love the camera, I love the audience. But I think the sort of third question I've been thinking about for this group is, Edmonia Lewis herself in her lifetime marketed herself. Like, she was hustling in her life. And I kind of wonder about the necessity of that kind of marketing of yourself when a lot of times my background is, I'm a historian, I was an art major in undergrad, and this idea of we're doing art for art's sake, and it's like, but you gotta eat. And so how are you doing that work? And I wondered, in that world where she was selling her artwork and selling herself and selling her story, did she ever get to switch it off? And who did she get to switch it off with? And that's sort of that was my history kind of question that I've been thinking about recently.
Okay. When you said that, I think of Sojourner Truth. I sell the shadow to support the substance. And that to me rings really true here. I mean, I guess it's really hard to know who Edmonia maybe was able to not perform for or feel like she had to perform for. You know, I think one of the really amazing and beautiful things about the book by Jennifer Brody, Moving Stones, is that she really does shine a spotlight on all of these relationships that Edmonia had, or potentially had, with these other Black women, some of them queer Black women, and there's a letter in particular written by a Black woman named Addie Brown, who in these letters describes her same-sex experiences at a school, but she also writes that she wishes that there were many more Edmonia Lewises. And so I wonder if these were the circles and if these were the women that Edmonia felt okay letting down those defenses and just kind of being. But again, I think there's so much that gets left out of the archive, so much that's not preserved, so much that is misinterpreted. Some things are destroyed. It's hard to know.
So again, how do we come to know Edmonia? Part of it for me started with Spelman. And Spelman has an amazing museum. They have an amazing archive. They have a women's resource and research center that was founded by Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheldahl. I need to say all of these names in this space very specifically. All of these women were in touch with, and again, and thank you, because when we think about who wrote things down, and that's part of it. And there's also the part of what we didn't have to write down, because Angela loves me. That's not a lesbian thing, that's not necessarily a queer thing. I live in sisterhood. Right? That's why we're sitting here. And so how do these things get documented? Who holds them? How are they engaged with? And all of these things. So again, sitting at the African Meeting House, we're talking about how do we know about these women? How do we know about these people that existed in all of these spaces? And who holds their stories? And who has the opportunity to share them? So we have Queer History Boston, we have the African Meeting House, we have the Museum of African American History, we have journalists, we have theater, we have all of these ways to keep these stories going. I think the reason that this is so important is because it's not natural right now. Like, we have to do extra work to do what should just happen naturally. And so like that's the shortest for like everything that everyone is doing and everything that Edmonia did. It's like, you know what? I can't do it here, like slip and slide, pivot, I'm going to Rome. And that's a conversation about migration. That's a conversation about just being mobile and what people have access to. And so the journalists, the theater, the sound, the archive, and how do we keep it? And Edmonia was one of those people, and this is not a queer conversation that is had about her work, but she never relegated herself to any portion of her intersectionality. She was all things at all times to herself and not for any particular gaze. She just existed. And I think that's the queerest fucking thing you can do. That's great.
Well, Frederick is off right now, our AI hologram. But one of the things, what I'm gonna say in front of Frederick, I'm glad he's off. In that one of the things that I was struck by was the idea that, oh, she learned how to document herself from Frederick Douglass, the most photographed man in history. Sometimes I'm like, is he a narcissist? But okay. Yes. but I'm also thinking about the performance of self through photography for people that were not supposed to be documented as humans, whether it is a Black person, a woman, a queer person. And so Edmonia Lewis's use of photography to sell herself was a disruption of what people assumed someone who should be captured this way should be allowed to be in front of a camera, should be allowed to document themselves, should be allowed to say, look at me. Another thread that I'm like pulling from my lore that I shared earlier is that in England in the 1880s, there was this moment called professional beauties, where these women would consider themselves to be kind of prostitutes, kind of courtesans, and they would just sell pictures of themselves. And they ended up being printed in newspapers at the time as, oh, this professional beauty. And they're gonna be here, they're gonna be at this salon, they're gonna be at this ball, and people would flock just to see them. They'd buy their postcards. They were basically like following them around like they were Beyonce or Britney Spears in the 19th century. And if I just think about Edmonia Lewis basically like replicating herself in this way, people could buy those small cartoon zines of her as though she was someone to fangirl over. And so I am thinking about like, what does it mean for that use of photography in her life to be so consequential for why we actually remember her, and we know what she looks like, we know how she wanted to represent herself, and also who she wanted to say she was in conversation with. Because one of the other conversations, so I did a walkthrough with the co-curator at PIM, because I was like, I want to hear what you have to say before this talk right now. And he was like, well, a lot of times when we think replicas of the work she was making, we're thinking, oh, she made smaller versions. But no, what if she was just selling photographs of all the work that she had made? What was that? What if that was replications and reproductions? And so she was very savvy through the use of photography to sell her work, to sell her art, and essentially turn herself into a celebrity, which is why it is astonishing that the prevailing narrative about her is that she disappeared and no one knew where she was buried.
Really? I mean, it's, because I'm a pop culture girly, I'm like, it's low-key the beginning of the influencer. Really of the Black influencer, to be honest. But there are many, I mean, right, there are so many Black influencers throughout history, and she utilized, as we do now, what technology is available to me to reach people who I normally wouldn't. And boom, photography changes everything. And I think the parallel now, Joan, you were like, what does it mean to like market yourself and then keep up with that? And I have to say, from my experience, it is rather heartbreaking and difficult all at the same time. Because people see the image and they think it is only the image. They don't think about what is the story behind that person and what are they dealing with. Like, yes, she was passing out like, you could get these photos of Edmonia, but then you don't know the Oberlin story. You don't know, why are you even here? It's like the Mean Girls moment. Why are you here? Like, but no one knows all of the heartache sometimes that comes with being the influencer, the it girl. A dear friend of mine said, everybody wants to be the it girl until the it girl has a problem. And I experienced that in real time in November, being dragged on right-wing media. And it was so surprising around who showed up to be in conversation with me versus who watched things happen. And what I've always loved about One Sisterhood and very specifically Black woman sisterhood, is that you're not ever alone. And also, Black women are magic, which we all know, but it's just for her to be like, I'm out, go to around, and literally become this overnight sensation. I mean, we saw it in the Renaissance with Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes and Jabal-Ren. And even, you know, you think about Lorraine Hansberry is also someone who I think about having these, right?
Everybody left.
Yes. I mean, I think about, and that ripples into today. I think there comes a moment for a lot of people where you have to walk away from what you know into the unknown, because that's where all the answers lie for you. And it takes a lot of faith, and I think, again, to get on a boat and be like, I'm out, I would have been like, girl, I'll see you later, because girl, I gotta stay. But for her to have that courage, and that ripple effect happens to so many artists. I mean, I love New York City, and people are like, you're going to move to Boston? People usually do the opposite. I said, I don't know what's there, but I'll see what's here. And here it is. It continues.
Yes.
You go where you're loved.
So Matisse, I think we want to facilitate a Q&A. I know, I'm like, I could just sit here and listen. I don't have a follow-up question. I'm just like, this is beautiful. And we're also, wow, I want to be like, we're all so fortunate. But we are, really. You're blessing us with your words and with your stories. And I just want to let you know, I really appreciate that. But I need to share the mic.
Can I say something?
Yes, please do.
So I had the most traumatic experience when I was working at the Boston Athenaeum. But that was also where I met the delightful Joan. And sometimes you meet the people full of the most light in the darkest places. So it's so good to see you.
There's an experience of looking around and being like, look at all these white straight people. What are we for? Like, we gotta get out, we gotta go. And that's the,
That's how we bonded.
looking at each other like. But yeah, Matisse, would you like to, or do you want me to hop up, or? I wanna give folks,
Yeah, we're just gonna do Q&A. Does anyone out in the audience have questions? Yes. Immediately. I'm gonna come to you. Here you go.
I've been sitting on it. One of the things, I just want to make a comment about the pen exhibit, and my partner and wife actually talked about how she wasn't there. You know, her art was there, but it was just, and one of the things that struck me is, one obvious one, you didn't have to look for planners, she sculpted all these abolitionists, which means she's an abolitionist, you know? It's like, but it was separated, it was kind of cold. Like she was just the artist and not part of, you know, right here on the hill. But the question I want to ask is, could you say a little bit more about what is in the archive at the Athenaeum that they have missed? I mean, how did they get an archive from her, and what is there that they've just been sitting on?
So I want to be clear, it's not just the Athenaeum. It's every institution that has and holds any of her work. Because this, I mean, granted Matisse is brilliant, as is Joan, and you know, and so on and so forth. But the fact that this is not natural, but these things have been sitting in these spaces. So when you think about some of the pieces that are on view at Peabody Essex Museum that, you know, were the result of a gambling debt, and that were sat and ruined, and someone finally decided that it was worthwhile to put into the Smithsonian. But what is that paper trail? What is that provenance? And regardless of what that provenance is, there's an oral history, and there's a societal conversation and a zeitgeist that happens with that. So it's like the granular answer to the conversation, but also there's no answer to that. People made decisions, and they continue to make decisions about who gets to be where, and how, and when. It's not just the Athenaeum. They have amazing carte de visites of her. Gorgeous, as does Penn, as does Mass Historical, as does the Smithsonian, as does the University of Maryland. So many people have these objects, and part of the challenge is they only see them as objects, and they continue to objectify and dehumanize Black women, so we never get our just due. So, I will say with my whole chest, the Athenaeum needs to do better, but they're not the only ones.
Another question. We'll do 1 and 2 here.
If you could queer the exhibit at PEM, can you each give, what would you do? How would it look different? How would you retell the narrative?
You asked the theater girl that question. Because I was like, so there's gonna be an interactive moment where you can, one, probably at the end, try to sculpt your own things. Try to create your own work, or your own replica, or your own tribute to her. That is one thing in terms of queering it, because sometimes, I sound like that woman from Sex and the City. No one's fun anymore. But it's like, sometimes you go into museums and you can't touch anything, but you're so moved. And so you want to do something. Like I remember seeing the Anne Moe exhibition at the Met, and I was like, I want to touch these garments. Why is there no accessible version to this? So one, it would be to have an option or an ability for you to make your own replica and tribute, but also to really have narratives of what queer life was like at that time period, embracing what was her world, specifically what was Black queer life in that time period. Create a short film that people can watch or see, or even a coffee table book that you can flip through, just because, like Beyonce, the visuals are you. But also, we love, we have our hologram projector. But I think there's something really great about the written word, like oral history, but I think some sort of visual film that documents who were the Black queer people of this moment, who were her friends, and no, we're not gonna do those really bad historical reenactments where no one looks like the person at all. But no, this is a joint conversation.
Well, but it makes me think about, and I'm looking at Ariel too, we're in New England, it's the home of the Boston marriage. Everybody went to school and was learning.
Boston is it's a plane.
Okay, so there you go.
But imagine TTO.
Well, Spelman was started by 2 white women, imagine that, in HBCU. But again, the queerness has always been here. It's how have we been talking about it? How has it been documenting it? When you're researching something, how do you know what you know to be true? And I will say this as a whole ass Black woman, I know what I know when I know it, and you're not gonna disprove me. You're gonna have to pick up an encyclopedia. I just showed my age, but you know what I mean. It's but there are histories that come from different places, so there are folks that kind of have a challenge. Speaking about Edmonia as a sculptor, as a fine artist, in this queer way, but I'm are we not talking about the whole history of New England though? At the same time, are we not talking about Oberlin, the women's college, and what was happening there?
And so it's like when you research, asking you a question, how do you know what you're reading? When you start digging into, because again, you have the oral histories, which is a little bit more theater, and like finding those recordings, but when you're documenting, and then Angela, same thing.
I will say that I think a lot about like Maroonage and like the Maroons, right, in Jamaica, but there were Maroon communities all throughout the Americas, including North America. And the way in which a lot of us have had to form these kind of private spaces for like our cultural survival, I start looking for those clues, right? And all of us in this room belong to different communities where there are certain clues and there are certain markers. You know, to find a Maroon community, you would have to know what to look for in order to navigate the forest, in order to reach that community. But you would probably only know those signs of your family, right? And so that's kind of how I look at the approach. Are you family? Exactly. So that's kind of how I approach it. And then also too, just like demanding more of journalism. And part of the reason that we have this problem with the archives is who is covering these people, who are writing these articles that then get submitted and put into the archives. Who are these journalists? And the majority of the time when we're looking in that time period, these were white journalists, white-run newspapers. And so also taking that with a huge grain of salt when you encounter these things in the archive is like, there is no objectivity here in this journalism. And we have to be like very, very, very aware of that when we're looking at these materials.
My last, well, so I will start off with saying I am the crazy person who decided to get a PhD in history. And so I have been forcibly trained on how to look in archives and make stories and synthesize information. And also because funding is tight, you learn to just go into an archive and just take pictures of everything and figure out what you're looking at when you go home at night. And that includes, so summer 6 years ago where I went to Nora Douglas Holt's papers at Beinecke Library at Yale, so Nora Douglas Holt. If you look her up, the lady had a life. She had about 5 husbands, some of them, you know, were overlapping. She also, surprisingly, for the 1930s, 1940s, had a lot of nude photographs taken of herself, so I was like, okay, go ahead with that. But I just went into her archive and I just took pictures of everything, so I have like 900 photos from her archive and then never used it for my dissertation. So that's what happens too. But to your question about the Boston Athenaeum's archives, and also your question about how would you queer this exhibition, because of that, I'm like, you would have to start this over from scratch. Because they were not reading the archives in a particular way to highlight that. They were reading the archives, their resources, and even the art. This is an art history exhibition. We're going to be looking at her technique, we're going to be looking at these pieces. I mean, when I was walking through with the curator, I asked, what are some of the pieces that were supposed to be in an exhibition that you could not get anyone to lend to you? And he was like, so many. There were a lot. And a lot of them are private collections. And one of the stories about going to like a very wealthy person in a mansion in New York, and they were just like, we don't need to give this to anyone. Like, this is for our own private enjoyment of her art. And so that's removing a story that the visitors can experience, that scholarship can engage with. So like these are deliberately constructed choices by how people choose to read the archive, what their emphasis is for an exhibition, and also like the logistics of who's going to lend these pieces to the museum for this exhibition. And by the way, like if you walked in and you turned and you saw the Robert Gould Shaw bust, that was the piece that we lent, and it was also reunited with the plaster for the first time in decades. And so that was also a conversation that we stopped to have about what does it mean for her to have had this plaster and then constructed the marble bust, but they were never in conversation with each other. And also the fact that she did this against the approval of white abolitionists. They were like, you're not allowed to do this. You shouldn't be sculpting this white man, how dare you? So like the fact that she even did it and that they still exist is her essentially going against what white abolitionists, who we think of as allies, but we're not. Yes. So she was in that work, she was doing that work that we're talking about right now, but because that was not the focus of the exhibition, you only hear it if you ask the curator what happened with these two pieces.
Speaking of logistics, there was also a weight issue. Is there?
Yeah.
Made of marble.
Yes.
I just want to say I want to be respectful of the museum's time. We've been going for a bit. So maybe we can have one more audience question and wrap. Yeah? Yes?
Well, maybe it's a statement and someone
Go
in
first.
Please go ahead. No, you go ahead.
We gotta do both hands. Shout out to Lorraine O'Brien. Yeah. We'll do both hands.
Both hands.
Let's do both hands.
I guess my question is, something that I'm chewing on right now is that this idea of archive for me in a certain way does demand permanence because it's taking physical artifacts and documents, but then beyond those ephemera, there is actually the act of interpreting, and that looks like sometimes going between or beyond, or reading what's between the lines. And I guess what I would love to hear your perspective on is how ephemeral arts fit into the experience of archiving. I'm a concert dance artist, so I deal in live performance. And how do you think that fits in with this idea of like cultural knowledge and intuition in this act of preservation?
Totally gonna throw Giselle under the bus. I'm like, that sounds like theater to me and performance.
Wait, so if you look, well, it should still be there. So like there are two headphones attached to that back pew. That is actually the afterlives of a performance that Jonathan Gonzalez built based on the blueprints of the African Meeting House that was staged at the end of February. And when discussing the afterlives of this performance, because it's basically a one and done. I mean, it was filmed, but it was for their archives. It wasn't for permanent dissemination, but they offered the recording of the sound of the performers who had sung, who had danced, who had moved through this space. And so that's also a choice that an artist can make. How do I actually want my work to be documented? You could say, if I'm a performer, I don't want this experience to be captured for people to watch on screen because it's supposed to be experienced in real life. Or maybe you're saying, I gestured this way once because I only want people to experience that one gesture in that way. But then again, we have that conversation, and so now we have the recording where people can sit and listen to the singing and then experience it in their own way that was very different from what was experienced when the performers were here in real life. And I do have experience, but I was not the curator, I just worked with them about time-based media, and one of the difficulties with that from the perspective of a curator, collections, even archivists, is media forms deteriorate. If we say we're gonna capture this MP3, maybe 20 years from now, MP3s are obsolete. So what do we do now? So then we have to build in contingency plans of what if this format is obsolete and we can never access this recording ever again. So that's also more money, more training, more things about the future. So I also, like, if you're thinking about this, like, you write down specifically, how does my work need to be captured, and how should future archivists of your work think about how it should be captured?
Like future-proofing.
Yes.
This is so loaded for me. Yes, ma'am. It's so interesting because there is always so many. I'll take it all the way back. When I create art, I really think about who is the little trans girl behind me who will get it, who will see it. And I think, how will I make sure she can access it? No matter what, how will she be able to access it? Like, you're like, MP3s will be obsolete. It'll go away. And so when I think about performance, yes, we tend to love to record it, but what we don't tend to do is preserve the process of making it. So we don't, and I started looking at it through my own life lens, like, okay, if someone archives, is like revealing my life in 100 years, okay, well, what was Giselle Bird doing in 2014? She wasn't Giselle Bird. If we look, this was the fashion, this was this, we have these images, we're preserving the process of becoming. And I think a lot about how do you make something that can't, like you're like, when you said, I know what I know, and this is fact, how do we make sure that we document to where it can't be questioned? On her wedding day, she wore this dress. Well, no, it was really this. Here's the one photo that you saw from the wedding. You can zoom in as much as you can, but that's that. It's when we think about period piece plays and how they are often done. And why people get upset when it's a Black woman playing Anne Boleyn, or they get angry when it's a version of Cats set in Harlem's ballroom culture. You have to remember that stories, everyone has a story and everyone has access to a story, and they have their own beliefs. But what you know, what you can control, you fight to control it. I don't know if I'm helping answer your question, but like as a performer, what I tend to make sure that we do is, first rehearsal is documented. We are keeping these sketches, we're keeping these displays. People will, and that means we gotta get a bigger storage unit. What were the sets? Very specifically with Smoke, this is a world premiere of a play by a Black trans woman. In 2090, I don't know what the world will be. And so when someone uncovers Smoke and tries to do it again, me and Lady Dane and Goldie and Joseph, like, we might be here, but we probably won't, who's to know? And so I say it's document your process, write about your process, be very thorough, because as a performer, and this is my acting school brain, the text will always be here. You can interpret, but sometimes the words are point blank, period, this is it. There is nothing else. Romeo and Juliet, she dies. That is it. There is no resurrection that happens. But then there's revival where you can make change. But when we are talking about our history, we want to be definitive. As I've started writing this memoir that Reverend Irene Monroe told me to, I'm being very definitive about who I am in this moment, who I was in the moment, and where I want to be. But I can only talk about what's now. And so I'm being very, very specific. And I think as performers, when we talk about our history and when we try to archive any moment that changes our cultural canon, we have to be very specific about that process and how we capture it and make sure that it is evergreen. Because otherwise, and also talk to journalists who we trust, who have that history and have that reputation to make sure no one's gonna reinterpret what I said. What did Giselle Bird really think of Massachusetts? She loved it. No. She had a lot of critique at a local, at a state level. She was fighting about arts and culture money. She was fighting about a lot of things that can't be disputed when you have the right people writing about you and also documenting it for yourself. And so as a performer, if you're creating a new work that you know is going, everything you do is history. That's what I'm really getting at. And everything you do is history. And so you have to treat it as such. And that weighs on me a lot. But it's how our truth gets passed on. And so it's like in this moment, we're sitting here about to go through this whole like award season, and I'm like, this historic moment, this is what really happened. This is who was there. This is what happened. This is how the world saw us maybe, but here's how these people saw me. And that's also the big thing, surrounding yourself with people who know your truth, who know your heart, and who will keep the story of you as whenever you leave this earthly plane. I know that sounds somber, but that, as a performer, is the biggest thing. Making sure you have those people who will carry your story, because then you're not ever gone. When I hear the elders talk about Sylvester in Boston, if you ask Danny Harris about Sylvester in Boston, I know it's not a lie. I know it's not embellished. It is very real. So I hope that answered your question.
Mine is a short homework assignment for the panel. Because I think I had never heard of Edmonia Lewis before I saw the exhibit last weekend. I mean, I'd seen it advertisements, but I would love if you could create a short bibliography, because I'm interested in doing further reading about her. I think when I left the exhibit, the thing that I felt was fortified, and I mean, we're kind of in a really dark moment, and sometimes it feels overwhelming, but I'm essentially a pessimistic optimist, so I feel bad, but I'm hopeful. And so I want to just get a reading list, and that way I can be inspired by her story, because this, to me, is this person represents someone who just, I think it was deeper than just, I don't know, somehow she just had a vision for herself and she held to it no matter how hard or dark it got. And I think we all need a little bit of that to keep us kind of moving forward. So if you can put a bibliography together with, I don't know, maybe 10 different references. And
we got it.
Yeah.
And so, did the zine,
I photograph this before you leave.
Okay. Did the zine come to you?
I haven't seen it.
Okay, there's a QR code in the back that has info on where we got the information from.
Okay.
I don't know if it's definitively the bibliography, but we can add some more recommendations to it. And the zine, I realized I don't know that we talked about this. The reason the zine came about is that we heard about the exhibit and we were excited about the exhibit, and then we started hearing from community and other museum and history professionals like, have you been to this? Do you know what's going on there? And after some conversations that were not progressing, my wife actually was like, you should hold a lesbian adventures protest and make a zine and get a drag queen to dress up as Edmonia and make a paper mache sculpture, and you want people to go in and see it, but you also want to educate them. And then I was on medical leave for a month, and then we had a million things happening, and it became that the zine was put together by a bunch of history volunteers of Queer History Boston, and with Ariel's help as well, and it has some more of that story, or at least gives you a way to think about the queer possibilities of her life. And so that's where that went. But we'll make sure it's more bibliographic, because there are wonderful books, there are podcasts, there are.
I was just looking for.
I want to find.
It's Moving Stones.
Yeah, Moving Stones, which just came out.
Moving Stones that just came out.
Yeah, Moving Stones, Jennifer Brody.
I don't want to I don't know Jennifer Brody.
Okay.
But Kirsten Pye Buick wrote the first book. And yeah, so start there, please. And it's Kirsten, not Kristen. Kirsten Pye Buick is, she started the conversation. And I think it's very important to, and I, watch movies and all sorts of things out of order. But I think it's important to start with who started. And I think that that makes sense too in thinking about the question of the archive and documenting and ephemera and all of those things. And the capital wealth management person in me, write it down. Where do you want your stuff to go? Because why doesn't Oberlin have her stuff?
They have a building named after her though.
Well, they do that with Black people all the time.
Well, and so again, but so again, it's like this is part of the conversation of your question. Is how is anyone going to know? It's like when you walk around Boston and you look, it's like whose name is on everything. That didn't happen by accident. Like the cities that we live in did not happen by accident. So there is some agency that we can start with, I think, now, and just making sure that we're aware that we matter and that we got us. Hence my baby announcement. So we can just show up and we don't have to get lost. We don't have to have that concern anymore. But financially, like business-wise, you need to write it down. Like you need to have an estate plan. Like all of the things that happen in the theater, it's like Lorraine O'Grady thinking about all of these amazing artists. It's like you have these sketches that they did of the costumes or of the sound or whatever it was. You matter, so make it matter. And then, we got you.
And Joan, briefly, when you get that bibliography, I want you to go to Mount Auburn Cemetery, go to the area and stand or sit underneath the sculpture of Hygeia that when he was commissioned to do. It's beautiful. And there's hidden family. You can touch it. You can touch it.
Yeah.
You can touch it.
And that's exact. And this is Mayor Denise Simmons here. And that's something too, that drove me, anyway, I was really mad after I saw the exhibit for the first time. I was like, what an opportunity, and like also I'm shaking with rage about a lot of things. But that's exactly it. There's this beautiful sculpture that is here in the Boston area, Mount Auburn Cemetery. We're doing a queer walking tour, but I think it may have sold out, so we're trying to get them to do another one in June. But that's
where the cemetery a little bit, like come in the front door, is it there? Because it's a big cemetery.
It's
just go, when you go to Auntie Bronte's cemetery, there's a chapel like that.
Right.
Go right in there and they'll tell you, give you a map, you'll get lost.
No,
She's not that far.
On the map, it's actually pretty easy to find.
Great.
Yeah.
I love it. See, all right,
And I think it's worth noting too, as we talk about, like ephemera and permanence, is that, Hygeia is deteriorating over time. She's changing her face. There's been a lot of deterioration to her face, and I think it's worth noting that Mount Auburn did not know what they had in Hygeia until relatively recently, until like around the 90s, when they really.
Is she marble?
Yes. White Italian Carrara marble, yes, very soft marble, and it just has a very specific reaction with New England weather that causes it to deteriorate at a faster rate.
But it's important to know that the City of Cambridge, through the Community Preservation Act, allocated $6,000 to improve it. Actually lost my hand. But the point is bringing attention to it. When they realized someone else was looking and said, what are you doing to this important piece of history, they started to pay more attention.
Yes.
Then you have to stay on about.
Yes, exactly.
I think I'm going to be a real moderator and say, thank you all so much. everyone who's here, and happy Pride Month. It's early and I'm so tired already. And if you'd like to learn more about everyone, I believe we have links on the event page for this. I don't want everyone to have to plug, like, this is my Instagram, but you should follow all of them. I'm saying all of us, I'm not very good at social media, but these are all such brilliant, interesting, wonderful people, and you should keep an eye on everything they're doing.
And like, don't follow me on Birds, that's where I'm chaotic.